when my daughter's fiancé stood up in front of nearly 100 people and accused me of stealing over $75,000 from her company. I simply reached into my jacket, took out my phone, and said calmly enough for the entire room to hear, "Evan, before we talk about missing money, we need to talk about your real name, the woman you're legally married to in Nevada, and the two other women you're currently promising a future to." The music cut out. The laughter died mid-breath. Every conversation in the room collapsed into silence. If you're listening to this story, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. Tell me in the comments where you're listening from. Evan's face drained of color so fast I thought he might faint. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. And in that moment, before the shouting, before the agent stepped forward, before my daughter's world cracked open, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. This was no longer just about money. Let me explain how we got here. My name is Daniel Whitmore. I'm a retired financial litigation attorney living outside Boulder, Colorado. And at the age of 67, I thought I understood manipulation. I'd spent 4 decades dismantling fraud cases, watching confident men lie under oath, watching families implode over trust misplaced in the wrong hands. I was wrong about one thing. I never imagined I'd be sitting in an art gallery filled with my daughter's investors, employees, and friends, listening to the man she planned to marry accuse me of betraying her, and watching her struggle to decide whether to believe him or her own father. That accusation didn't come out of nowhere. It had been carefully engineered, but I'm getting ahead of myself. 6 months earlier, my daughter Lena had called me, her voice bright with the kind of excitement you only hear when someone's life is finally aligning. "Dad," she said, "we closed the funding. Lena is my only child. She built her branding and strategy firm from nothing over nearly a decade. Late nights, burned weekends, rejected pitches, quiet perseverance. When her firm finally secured a major private investment to expand nationally, I felt a pride so deep it nearly hurt. She invited me to the launch gala herself, insisted I sit near the front, told everyone I was the reason she learned to question contracts twice and trust instincts once. What she didn't tell me, not then, was that she'd already met Evan Clark. They met at a leadership retreat in the spring. Evan presented himself as a seasoned venture advisor, confident, articulate, impeccably dressed. He spoke about scaling companies, guiding founders, believing in people before they believe in themselves. Within weeks, he was everywhere. Within months, he was indispensable. The first time I met him was at a small family dinner. I remember shaking his hand and feeling something tighten in my chest. Not fear, recognition. His stories flowed too smoothly. His charm never faltered. And when I asked questions that required specifics, dates, filings, names, he answered beautifully without answering at all. Lena noticed my silence. "Dad," she said with a smile that wasn't entirely relaxed, "please don't interrogate my fiancé." Fiancé? Already. I backed off. I always had. Lena was a grown woman, brilliant, capable, and fiercely independent. I told myself this was my problem, not hers. By early summer, Evan had positioned himself as her informal advisor, then her strategic partner, then quietly her financial gatekeeper. He helped organize accounts. He recommended a legal consultant. He suggested adjustments for investor confidence. Each change was reasonable on its own. Together, they formed a trap. 3 days before the gala, Evan called me. "Daniel," he said, warm and measured, "we need to talk. Privately." We met at a cafe near my home. He arrived early, documents neatly stacked, concern etched carefully across his face. "I hate to bring this to you," he said, sliding papers toward me, "but Lena asked me to review the books before the launch. There are discrepancies." He paused just long enough for the word to sink in. "Over the past few months," he continued, "approximately $75,000 has been transferred out of the company account. All of it to an account registered in your name." The world didn't spin. My hands didn't shake. Instead, a familiar cold settled in my gut. Because I knew, instantly, that this wasn't a mistake. And that accusation he would soon make, publicly, strategically, devastatingly, was never meant to be resolved quietly. It was meant to destroy me. Now, Let me take you back to the moment I realized exactly what kind of man my daughter had fallen in love with. To understand why Evan's accusation carried weight, why it landed like a blade instead of joke, you have to understand my relationship with Lena long before he ever entered the picture. Her mother and I divorced when Lena was in graduate school. There was no scandal, no betrayal. Just two people who finally accepted they worked better as parents than as partners. Her mother moved to Santa Fe and remarried a landscape architect. I stayed in Colorado, kept my practice another decade, then retired quietly. Lena never had to choose sides. We made sure of that. Weekly calls, holiday rotations. No poison, no guilt. If anything, our relationship strengthened with time. She was always sharp, curious, skeptical in the right ways. When she started her firm, she brought contracts to my kitchen table, red pen in hand. "Tell me what I'm missing," she'd say. And I would. Not as her lawyer. I refused to be that, but as her father. As someone who had watched brilliant people lose everything because they trusted charisma more than documentation. That's why the shift was so subtle at first. I almost missed it. After Evan entered her life, our conversations changed tone. Not dramatically, just selectively. She stopped asking certain questions, stopped forwarding drafts. When I offered thoughts, she'd smile and say, "We've already covered that." Covered. Not I covered. We. Evan had become a constant presence. By early summer, Lena told me he'd moved into her townhouse temporarily. It made sense, she said. He traveled constantly. It was easier, more efficient. Efficiency is a word that should always raise suspicion when it's applied to relationships. The next time we met for coffee, Evan came along uninvited. He spoke most of the time, praised Lena relentlessly, framed himself as her biggest supporter. "She's wasted years playing small," he said. "I'm just helping her see what she's capable of." Lena beamed. I watched his hands, the way he touched her shoulder lightly when she spoke, the way he answered questions directed at her. He wasn't controlling yet. He was curating. I asked about his background again, this time more casually. "Remind me," I said. "Your last venture, was that registered in California or New York?" He laughed easily. "Both, depending how you define registration." It was a non-answer wrapped in confidence, the kind that makes people feel foolish for pressing. I let it go. That night, Lena called me. "Dad," she said, a little sharper than usual, "Evan feels like you don't trust him." "I don't trust people I don't know," I replied, "especially people who step into financial decisions quickly." "He's not taking anything from me," she said. "He's helping. You always taught me to accept help." "Yes," I said, "from people whose incentives are aligned with yours." There was a pause. "You don't like that I'm not doing this alone anymore," she said quietly. That one hurt, because it wasn't true, and because Evan had planned it carefully. "I don't like that you're being rushed," I said. "Big changes, big commitments, no independent review." She exhaled. "You're overthinking this. For once, can you just be happy for me?" I told myself to step back. I told myself this was her life, that my role was support, not suspicion. Then the business changes accelerated. Evan suggested restructuring accounts to streamline oversight. He proposed adding signatories for redundancy. He introduced Lena to a legal consultant who specialized in rapid growth firms. She mentioned all this casually like it was settled. When I suggested she have her own attorney review the documents, she bristled. "He believes in me," she said. "Why do you assume bad intentions?" I didn't answer that directly. I said something safer. Because belief without accountability is how people get hurt. That conversation ended early. By midsummer, Lena stopped calling weekly. She was busy, traveling, preparing for the gala. Evan had encouraged her to protect her energy. I recognized the pattern then. Not because it was obvious, but because I'd seen it before in depositions, in victim statements, in ruined balance sheets disguised as love stories. Isolation doesn't arrive loudly. It arrives politely. The gala invitation arrived in late July. Elegant, professional, the firm's new name embossed in silver. Her maiden name's still there. That detail moved me more than I expected. I called her immediately. "You kept the name?" I said. "Of course I did," she replied. "You're part of why this exists." For a moment, I thought maybe I was wrong. Maybe Evan was simply different. Maybe my instincts had calcified with age. 3 days later, Evan called. And by the time we met at that cafe, by the time he slid those papers across the table and accused me, gently, compassionately, of siphoning money from my own daughter, I understood exactly how carefully he'd constructed the narrative. He didn't want Lena to question him. He wanted her to question me. And the gala wasn't a celebration. It was a stage. The cafe was nearly empty by the time Evan finished laying out his case. He sat across from me with his hands folded neatly on the table, his posture open, cooperative, the posture of a man performing concern rather than feeling it. The documents between us were arranged with deliberate care. Bank summaries, transfer logs, highlighted figures, timestamps, everything designed to overwhelm before being questioned. I wanted to handle this quietly, he said. For Lena's sake. I didn't touch the papers. Quietly, I repeated. Yes, he said, nodding. Families survive hard truths when they're handled with discretion. There was the first tell. He was already framing the outcome. I leaned back slightly. Before we go any further, tell me something. Why would Lena believe I had access to her operating accounts? He didn't hesitate. She added you as a secondary signatory in early spring, he said, right after the funding cleared. She told me she wanted a safety net, someone she trusted implicitly. That part was true. She had mentioned it casually months earlier. I'd never used the access. Never needed to. And the authorization codes? I asked. They match your profile, he said. Every transfer. I nodded once, slowly. Then you won't mind if I call my bank right now, I said. For the first time, something flickered across his face. Not panic. Evan was too disciplined for that, but irritation. Like a man interrupted mid-performance. Daniel, he said gently, this doesn't need to become adversarial. Adversarial? You're accusing me of stealing from my daughter, I replied. We passed adversarial 5 minutes ago. He leaned forward then, voice lowering. I'm trying to protect her, he said, from public embarrassment, from legal exposure, from having her company associated with a criminal investigation days before a national launch. There it was. The threat, wrapped in concern. I haven't told her yet, he continued. I wanted to give you the chance to explain, or to fix this. Fix, I said. Meaning what? He exhaled, as if burdened by responsibility. The money is returned, he said, quietly. You step away from any involvement with the company. Lena never has to know her father put her at risk. I stared at him. You're asking me to confess to a crime I didn't commit, I said, so you can remove me from her life without resistance. He didn't deny it. Instead, his tone hardened just enough to drop the mask. Daniel, he said, I'm trying to help you preserve your relationship with your daughter. If this goes public, if authorities get involved, she'll never forgive you. She might forgive weakness. She won't forgive betrayal. That was the moment I understood the full design. This was never about money. It was about erasure. I pulled out my phone. I'm calling my bank, I said. He reached across the table, not aggressively, but decisively, and placed his hand over mine. I wouldn't, he said. I looked at his hand, then at his eyes. And why is that? Because if you make this difficult, he said calmly, I'll have no choice but to involve Lena immediately. And the police. I already have counsel prepared. Counsel? Of course he did. The gala is in 3 days, he added. I'll be proposing to Lena that night. Publicly. In front of her investors. It's a perfect moment. Engagement. Another lock. I'd hate for that to be overshadowed, he said, by allegations of embezzlement. I removed my hand from under his. You're confident, I said. I'm prepared, he corrected. He stood, straightening his jacket. You have until the gala, he said. If you want advice, claim financial trouble. Gambling debts. Something that makes you look flawed rather than malicious. Lena loves you. She might understand. He smiled then. A polite, professional smile. She won't understand theft. He left without waiting for a response. I sat there long after he was gone, staring at the untouched papers, listening to the hum of the espresso machine behind the counter. In my career, I had seen this exact maneuver dozens of times. Create false evidence. Isolate the target. Force a confession to avoid exposure. Remove the obstacle. Evan didn't want my money. He wanted my silence. I called my bank immediately. No transfers. No anomalies. No withdrawals initiated under my credentials. Then I called Lena's bank, posing as a secondary signatory, verifying security protocols. They confirmed what I already suspected. No activity had been authorized under my profile. The documents Evan showed me were fabrications. And that meant something far worse. Because if he was willing to manufacture evidence against me, her father, then Lena wasn't just being manipulated. She was being positioned. That night, I didn't sleep. I made a list instead. Every inconsistency, every vague answer, every identity gap. By morning, I knew what I had to do. I couldn't warn Lena. Not yet. Because Evan had already trained her to see my concern as control. If I confronted him privately, he'd disappear. If I confronted him publicly, with proof, he wouldn't have time to run. The gala wasn't just a stage. It was the trap. And for the first time since retiring, I went back to doing what I did best. I started digging. I've always believed there are two kinds of lies. The impulsive kind, sloppy, emotional, reactive. And the professional kind, patient, layered, designed to survive scrutiny. Evan's accusation belonged to the second category, which meant whoever he really was, he'd done this before. I started where I always did: records, corporate filings, business registries, civil cases. I had access to databases most retirees no longer touch, and favors I'd earned over a lifetime of not wasting people's time. Evan Clark appeared 5 years earlier. Fully formed, clean credit history, immaculate digital footprint. To immaculate, no college records before that year, no early employment, no failed ventures, no trail of mistakes. Real lives leave dents. Manufactured ones don't. I expanded the search. Reverse image queries, cross-reference phone numbers, travel patterns, social connections that didn't quite line up. By the end of the first day, the name Evan Clark had started to dissolve. The second identity surfaced just after midnight. Different state, different face, same posture, same smile, different woman. She was tagged in a professional announcement from 3 years earlier. Thrilled to announce my engagement to Lucas Hale, my partner and greatest supporter. Lucas Hale was Evan Clark. I slept for 3 hours, then kept going. By the following evening, I had 3 names, 3 regions, 3 women, all successful, all ambitious, all isolated just before collapse. This wasn't romance. It was acquisition. I made one phone call I hadn't planned on making again. "Sarah," I said when she answered. "It's Daniel Whitmore." She paused, then laughed softly. "I was wondering when you'd call," she said. Sarah Lynn and I had crossed paths years earlier, when she was a junior analyst working federal financial crimes. She'd moved up since then, quietly, relentlessly. "I need a favor," I said. She didn't ask what kind. We met the next morning in a nondescript office building that didn't advertise what it housed. I laid out everything: the documents, the identities, the fabricated transfers, the engagement timeline. She didn't interrupt. When I finished, she leaned back and exhaled. "You didn't just stumble onto a con artist," she said. "You found someone we've been chasing." She turned her tablet toward me. The face was older in the photo, harder, but unmistakable. "His real name is Aaron Pike," she said. "At least, that's the name on the earliest arrest we can verify. Multiple states, identity fraud, wire manipulation, asset infiltration." "How long?" I asked. "Over a decade," she replied. "He adapts, evolves, targets women with expanding financial ecosystems. He doesn't drain accounts immediately. He embeds himself." I swallowed. "Lena," Sarah nodded grimly. "She fits the pattern." I told her about the gala. She looked at the date. "That's soon," she said. "He's proposing," I added. "Publicly." Sarah's jaw tightened. "He's locking access," she said. "Marriage creates leverage, emotional and legal." "What do you need?" I asked. "Proof we can act on," she said. "Confession, recorded admission, something that ties the identities together." "If I push him," I said, "he runs." "Unless he thinks he's already won," she replied. That's when the plan formed. They'd be there, quietly. Guests, staff, faces no one would notice. If I could get him to talk, really talk, they could move. If not, they'd trail him. But there was no guarantee he wouldn't vanish again. I left that building with a recorder smaller than my thumb and a weight on my chest I hadn't felt since my first trial. Because this wasn't about winning anymore. It was about timing and protecting my daughter from learning the truth in the worst possible way. The night before the gala, Lena called me. She sounded nervous, excited, distracted. Evan says tomorrow is going to change everything, she said. He's been so supportive, Dad. I don't know what I'd do without him. I closed my eyes. Lena, I said carefully, if I asked you to trust me tomorrow, no matter what happens, could you? There was a pause. Why? She asked. Just answer me, I said. I trust you, she said finally. I always have. It wasn't a full answer, but it was enough. I arrived at the gallery early. That alone should tell you how tightly wound I was. The space Lena had chosen was a renovated industrial hall just off downtown Boulder. Exposed brick, polished concrete floors, soft amber lighting. Elegant without trying too hard. Exactly like her. Along the walls were framed campaign mock-ups, growth charts, testimonials from clients she'd carried from startup to success. This night mattered. I clipped the recording device beneath my jacket, checked it once, then forced myself to breathe like a guest, not a defendant. Lena spotted me as soon as I stepped inside. She crossed the room and hugged me hard, the way she used to when she was a child, running toward me after school. I'm so glad you're here early, she said. I don't know why, but I'm a wreck. You've earned this night, I said. No matter what happens. She smiled, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. Evan appeared beside her seconds later, smooth as a shadow. Daniel, he said warmly. I was hoping we'd get a chance to talk. His hand rested lightly on Lena's back, possessive, subtle, practiced. Later, Lena said quickly, I need to greet the investors. She squeezed my arm before moving away. Evan watched her go. Then he turned to me. You look tense, he said. Big night. For all of us, I replied. He leaned closer, lowering his voice. This is your last chance, he said quietly. Don't embarrass her. The words were soft. The threat was not. I scanned the room casually. Near the bar, a couple in their 40s stood too still, watching without watching. Another man adjusted a display sign twice without reason. Sarah's people. Good. Guests poured in. Laughter rose. Glasses clinked. Lena moved from group to group, radiant and distracted. Evan worked the room like a seasoned politician, introducing himself as her partner in everything but name. About an hour in, Lena stepped onto the small stage to thank everyone. Her voice shook at first, then steadied. She spoke about risk, about vision, about trust. My chest tightened with pride. When she finished, applause filled the room. That's when Evan stepped forward. He took the microphone smoothly. There's something I'd like to share, he said. Something personal. My pulse slowed. This was it. Before he could continue, he turned deliberately and looked straight at me. Before I do, he said, there's an issue that needs to be addressed. The room quieted. He straightened, voice projecting. Over the past several months, significant funds have been siphoned from Lena's company accounts. Over $75,000. The transfers traced back to one source. Every eye followed his gaze. To me, a murmur rippled through the crowd. I didn't move. Evan, Lena said softly, confused. What are you talking about? He raised a hand gently, as if to calm her. I didn't want to do this, he said. But integrity matters, especially tonight. He looked back at me. Daniel, he said, do you want to explain why you stole from your own daughter? Silence felt like a dropped curtain. I reached into my jacket, pulled out my phone, and said calmly, clearly for everyone to hear, Evan, or should I say Aaron, we need to talk about your real name, your wife in Nevada, and the two other women you're currently engaged to. The room froze. Evan's face went white, and that was just the beginning. For a moment, no one moved. It was the kind of pause that felt unnatural, not silence. Exactly, but suspension, as if the room itself had inhaled and forgotten how to exhale. The gallery lights hummed softly overhead. Somewhere near the back, a glass clinked against a tray and then went still. Evan stood beside the microphone, one hand resting on the stand as though it were the only solid thing left in the world. His mouth was slightly open, frozen mid-thought, mid-smile. The expression he'd perfected relaxed confidence. Affectionate authority had slipped just enough to reveal something else underneath. Panic. His eyes moved first. Not to Lena, not to the audience. They darted across the room, sharp and calculating, scanning faces, exits, angles. Measuring, adjusting. The man who had owned every room he entered all evening suddenly looked like someone searching for a door that had quietly vanished. "This is ridiculous," he said at last, forcing a laugh that landed a fraction of a second too late. The timing was off. The ease was manufactured. Daniel's confused. He's making things up to deflect attention from himself. A few people shifted. A polite murmur rippled through the crowd, not agreement. Not disbelief, but discomfort. The audience wanted this to be nothing. They wanted to go back to champagne and applause and the clean arc of a successful night. Lena stood a few feet away, still holding the small remote she'd used moments earlier to advance her final slide. Her fingers were white around it. She hadn't moved, hadn't blinked. I stepped forward before Evan could build momentum. "Your real name," I said, my voice calm, measured, pitch just loud enough to carry without performance, "is Aaron Pike." The name landed with a dull, unfamiliar weight. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't need to be. "You were legally married under that name in Nevada 3 years ago," I continued. "You're currently engaged, not dating. Engaged to a software executive in California and a commercial real estate developer in Texas." The murmurs sharpened, turned into gasps. Someone near the front sucked in a breath, so sharply it sounded like pain. Lena turned toward Evan slowly, as though the movement required conscious effort. The color drained from her face in stages: first shock, then disbelief, then something closer to physical nausea. "That's not true," Evan said quickly, too quickly. He turned toward her, abandoning the room. His voice softened, adopted the intimate tone he always used with her when he needed reassurance to feel like loyalty. "You know, he's always hated me. He's jealous. He can't stand that you don't need him the way he wants." A familiar script, a practiced pivot. I stepped closer, not aggressively, not theatrically, just enough to remove the illusion that this was a private conversation. "You use the same pattern every time," I said. "Fast attachment, emotional reinforcement, financial access, then isolation." Evan's jaw tightened. "You don't steal immediately," I went on. "You wait until the assets grow, until control feels mutual, until leaving feels irresponsible." His fingers curled slightly around the microphone stand. "I don't know what you're talking about," he snapped, the softness gone now. A flash of anger cut through his voice, sharp, involuntary. "You do," I said. "You just forgot one thing." I raised my phone. "You like to talk when you think you've already won." For half a second, nothing happened. Then something in him shifted. Not rage, not fear, contempt. The mask didn't fall all at once. It cracked. A thin fracture ran through the polished surface he'd spent years perfecting. His posture changed subtly, shoulders squaring, chin lifting, eyes hardening as though he were no longer performing for anyone. His voice dropped. "You think you're smarter than me because you're old and bitter?" he hissed. The words were sharp, venomous, stripped of charm. "These women give me everything willingly. They want someone who believes in them. I just happen to be that person." The room inhaled as one. Lena staggered back, as if the words had struck her physically. Her heel caught on the edge of the stage platform, and she reached out blindly, steadying herself against the table. "I give them confidence," Evan continued, momentum building now, his ego mistaking exposure for victory. "They hand over access, authority, trust. You're not saving her. You're just angry she didn't need you anymore." It was confession dressed as justification. He didn't see it, or didn't care. That was when Sarah stepped forward. She didn't rush, didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. She reached into her jacket, withdrew her badge, and held it up at chest level, clear, unmistakable. "Aaron Pike," she said evenly, "you're under arrest for wire fraud, identity theft, and conspiracy to commit financial crimes." The words cut through the room like a blade. 2 agents appeared from opposite sides of the gallery, their movements smooth, coordinated, unmistakably rehearsed. The illusion shattered completely then. Conversations erupted. Someone shouted. Someone else laughed in disbelief. A glass shattered near the back. Evan spun toward Lena. "Baby, don't listen to them," he pleaded, panic flooding back in, raw and desperate. "Your father set this up. He's lying. Tell them it's not true." Lena didn't answer. She was staring at Sarah's tablet, now angled toward her. The screen glowed stark and unforgiving. Photographs. Different women. Different cities. Different names. Same man. Her hand flew to her mouth. "Oh my God," she whispered. Evan lunged for my phone. He didn't get far. The agents restrained him swiftly, efficiently, hands locking around his arms as though they'd done this 100 times before, which they had. They read his rights as they secured his wrists behind his back. "This is a mistake," he shouted. "You can't do this. She chose me." "She didn't choose a criminal," Sarah said calmly. "She was targeted." The words hit Lena like a wave. Her knees buckled. One of her employees rushed forward, catching her before she hit the floor. Lena clutched at the woman's arm, her body folding inward as if trying to disappear. As Evan was led away, still shouting, still trying to control the story, the gallery fell into stunned silence. The launch, the proposal, the illusion, all gone. I crossed the room slowly. "Lena," I said softly. She looked up at me, tears streaming freely now, her face stripped of defenses, her voice hollow. "You knew," she said. "You knew and you didn't tell me." "For 3 days," I said, "and I was afraid you wouldn't believe me." She nodded, swallowing hard. "I wouldn't have," she admitted. That hurt more than any accusation ever could. Around us, investors whispered. Employees stood frozen. The night she'd worked toward for years had collapsed into chaos. But something else had happened too. She was safe. And for the first time since Evan entered her life, the narrative was no longer under his control. The gallery emptied slowly, not in the clean, efficient way it was supposed to after a successful launch, but hesitantly people lingering at the edges of conversations, circling back toward exits they had already approached once. No one seemed quite sure what the etiquette was for leaving a night like that. There were no cues, no closing remarks, no collective agreement that it was over. Conversations formed and dissolved in low tones, then reformed with different configurations. People spoke and stopped speaking mid-sentence. Names were repeated, sometimes incorrectly, then corrected. The words investigation and exposure passed between mouths like fragile objects, handled carefully, quickly set down. No one wanted to be the first to walk away. Leaving felt like confirmation, like acknowledgement that what had just happened could not be undone, reframed, or softened with time and distance. As long as they remained in the room, some part of the evening still existed in suspension. Investors clustered in small knots, bodies angled inward, shoulders tight. Their voices were pitched carefully between professionalism and alarm. Some spoke in clipped sentences about exposure, timelines, contingencies, language designed to sound controlled even when it wasn't. They talked about capital structures and legal thresholds, about fiduciary duty and communication strategy. Others said nothing at all. They stood with drinks untouched in their hands, faces drawn, eyes scanning the room as if recalculating loyalties in real time. You could almost see the internal ledgers being revised, risk reassessed, trust reweighted, future conversations mentally rehearsed. Employees hovered near Lena. They did not crowd her. They did not leave either. Some stood close enough to intervene if she faltered, unsure whether comfort would be welcome or invasive. A few looked angry, not at her, but at the realization that they had been adjacent to something dangerous without knowing it. A few looked frightened, already thinking ahead to headlines, resumes, the fragile portability of reputations. Most looked betrayed, not by her exactly, but by the sudden understanding that proximity to power had also placed them near harm, that the very success they had believed in had come bundled with a risk they had not consented to. The catering staff packed up untouched trays of food. They worked quietly, efficiently, without comment. Glasses still beaded with condensation were lifted and cleared. Napkins folded back into neat stacks. Servers avoided eye contact, not out of indifference but discretion. They had learned, Over years of working events like this, how to disappear at the right moment. The cake designed, approved, delivered remained untouched at the edge of the room. Tiered, iced, lettered with precision. A small monument to an evening that had ended before it began. What was supposed to be the defining night of Lena's career had become its most public rupture. Not a scandal in the traditional sense. Not spectacle. A fracture. Clean. Visible. Impossible to ignore. Sarah and her team moved through the space with practiced calm. They didn't rush. They didn't dramatize. They did not acknowledge the crowd beyond what was necessary to move through it. They collected devices, photographed documents, secured evidence. Phones were placed into bags. Laptops cataloged. Flash drives labeled. Their efficiency had a strange steadiness to it, the kind that only comes from having seen this kind of collapse before. From understanding that emotional fallout was not the same as operational urgency. That people would unravel later. Evidence needed to be secured now. They spoke in low voices, using first names, confirming times and sequences. One agent quietly closed a door that had been left ajar. Another marked a section of the room with tape, unobtrusive, but final. Lena sat on a bench near the entrance. Her back was straight. Her hands were folded neatly in her lap, fingers interlaced with care. She stared at the floor as if it might explain how her life had split cleanly down the middle without her ever noticing the crack. She looked composed in the way people do when composure is all that remains. I approached slowly. I did not want to startle her. I did not want to impose. The distance between us felt suddenly ceremonial, charged with things neither of us had yet said. She didn't look up. "You knew," she said again. Her voice was quieter now, stripped of accusation. What remained was disbelief. Not outrage, not anger, disbelief. "And you still let me walk out there?" "I'll let you keep your dignity," I replied. I took the hit instead. She laughed once. It was short, broken, almost involuntary. The sound startled her as much as it startled me. "I defended him," she said. "I pushed you away for him." The words were not self-pitying. They were factual. Inventory, not confession. "You were manipulated," I said. "That's not a moral failure." She finally looked at me then. Her eyes were red, raw, unfocused in the way that comes after adrenaline drains and shock begins to settle. She looked younger somehow, exposed, like the layers she had built to survive success had slipped out of place. "I signed documents," she whispered. "Partnership papers." He said it was temporary, strategic. The words came out carefully, as though speaking too quickly might cause them to shatter. As though naming them too directly might make them real in ways she was not yet ready to face. Sarah joined us, crouching slightly, so she was at Lena's level. She didn't crowd her, didn't rush the moment. She positioned herself just close enough to be present, not close enough to be overwhelming. "We'll need to review everything," she said gently. "There's a strong chance those documents are invalid. The attorney he introduced you to isn't licensed in this state." Lena closed her eyes. "I didn't even check," she said. "I was so focused on momentum. There was no attempt to excuse it, no attempt to soften the admission." "That's what he counts on," Sarah said. "Speed over scrutiny." The phrase landed hard. It had the weight of experience behind it. Not theory, not training, practice. By the time the last guest left, it was nearly midnight. The gallery felt cavernous without people. Sound behaved differently without bodies to absorb it. Footsteps echoed. Voices bounced. Silence felt larger, more insistent. Chairs stood half-pushed under tables. Abandoned jackets lay folded over backs of seats, forgotten in the chaos. The remnants of a celebration paused mid-breath. Lena and I sat side by side on the bench for a long time without speaking. Neither of us reached for a phone. Neither of us filled the space. The night air pressed coolly against the glass doors. Somewhere outside, traffic moved on, indifferent. A siren passed and faded. A bus exhaled at a stoplight. "I thought you didn't believe in me anymore," she said eventually. The sentence was quiet, unadorned. "I believed in you enough to risk you hating me," I said. She nodded slowly. "That's worse," she said. Then, after a beat, and better, the investigation unfolded quickly after that. Not emotionally, it unfolded in waves, but operationally, the machinery moved fast. Evan Aaron didn't get bail. Too many aliases, too many open warrants, too much evidence already stitched together before the night he'd finally been exposed. As the days passed, more women came forward. Some spoke publicly, giving statements that appeared in trade publications and local papers. Others chose privacy, their names sealed, their stories known only to investigators and attorneys. Their accounts overlapped with unsettling precision. Different industries, different cities, same cadence, same promises, same gradual erosion of independence, reframed as partnership. The documents he'd had Lena sign would have transferred majority control of her company within months. Not immediately, not conspicuously, gradually, legally, irrevocably. He hadn't stolen from her yet. He'd been preparing to own her. The FBI froze her accounts temporarily. That alone sent shockwaves. Payroll had to be rerouted through emergency measures. Vendors had to be reassured, some patiently, some urgently. Investors were notified. Meetings were canceled, then rescheduled, then cautiously reopened. Legal teams reviewed contracts line by line, not looking for damage, looking for survivability. Some investors pulled out quietly, citing risk tolerance and governance concerns. Their emails were polite, regretful, final. Others leaned in. They saw something in how Lena handled the crisis, her transparency, her refusal to hide, the way she answered questions directly even when the answers were uncomfortable. It impressed them more than a flawless launch ever could have. She didn't spin the story. She told it. A week later, we sat at my kitchen table. Papers were spread out across the surface bank statements, contracts, timelines. The table had not been this covered since she was in college, studying for finals. The red pen was back in her hand. "Tell me what I'm missing," she said. It felt like coming home, not because the crisis was over, it wasn't, but because the posture had changed. She wasn't being guided. She wasn't being reassured. She was leading again. We worked in silence for a while. Occasionally, she paused, brow furrowing, recalculating assumptions she'd once taken for granted. I watched her unlearn the version of certainty he'd fed her and replace it with something steadier, slower, more resilient. "This part," she said once, tapping a clause with the pen. He framed it as flexibility. "It's control," I said. She nodded, made a note, moved on. The damage was real. There was no denying that. But so was her competence. And unlike him, she didn't mistake adaptation for weakness. When she finally leaned back in her chair, exhausted, she didn't look defeated. She looked awake. The legal process moved slower than the arrest. It always does. The arrest had been decisive, almost surgical swift movement, clean language, visible authority. It had felt like resolution, a line drawn, a moment where momentum finally favored the truth. But the legal system did not operate on momentum. What followed was something far less dramatic and far more exhausting. Filings stacked into folders thick enough to strain their bindings. Continuances granted for reasons that felt procedural rather than just statements taken and retaken until language itself began to feel suspect. Truth did not arrive in a rush. It did not burst through doors or announce itself with certainty. It arrived in increments, through documentation and repetition, through quiet rooms that smelled faintly of paper, disinfectant, and stale coffee, through questions asked 3 different ways to see whether the answer changed, through pauses that stretched long enough to reveal whether a person was thinking or remembering. The night of the arrest had felt like an ending. The months that followed made it clear it was only the beginning. Evan Aaron stopped pretending almost immediately. Once the aliases collapsed, so did the charm. There were no interviews, no carefully worded statements drafted by publicists, no apologies framed as misunderstanding. He did not attempt remorse as a strategy. He dismissed his public defender twice within the first month, each time citing philosophical differences that amounted to his refusal to accept the scope of the evidence. When a replacement was appointed, he rejected her as well, insisting she was unmotivated. Eventually, he petitioned the court to represent himself. It lasted 3 days. 3 days of procedural chaos, rambling objections, and a tone that oscillated between condescension and wounded pride. The judge intervened before the damage became irreversible, appointing counsel and warning him on the record that further obstruction would be treated as contempt. Aaron seemed to believe silence would preserve leverage, that by refusing to explain himself, by declining interviews, by withholding narrative, he could still control the shape of the story. That absence could function as dominance. It didn't work. Silence only sharpened the outlines of the evidence. Digital trails surfaced first because they always do. Financial transfers routed through shell accounts registered to defunct LLCs. Layered movements designed to look like routine business activity until viewed in sequence. Login histories showing access from Nevada, California, and Texas within hours of one another, sometimes minutes, suggesting not travel, but control. Audio recordings followed. Some were careless voicemails left too long. Conversations assumed to be private. Others were arrogant, spoken with the confidence of someone who believed he was untouchable. He talked freely about positioning, about timing, about asset consolidation, never once considering that someone might eventually listen without his permission. He never used the word steal. He didn't have to. Then came the patterns. Investigators laid them out like a map pinned to a wall. Initial contact made to appear coincidental. Emotional mirroring calibrated to the target. Accelerated intimacy framed as efficiency. Gradual redirection of authority disguised as partnership. The language shifted slightly depending on the woman, tailored, adaptive, but the structure never changed. Support became guidance. Guidance became oversight. Oversight became dependence. The system did not need villainy to prove intent. It needed repetition, and repetition was everywhere. Testimony followed, not all at once, not dramatically. Women came in one by one, sometimes alone, sometimes accompanied by counsel, sometimes clutching notebooks filled with dates and impressions they had once dismissed as paranoia. Many had spent years blaming themselves. Most had never told the full story aloud. Some cried, some didn't. Most spoke with careful precision, afraid even now of exaggeration, of being dismissed as emotional, of being told again that they should have known better. They weren't. The prosecutors did not rush them. They did not interrupt. They let silences sit. They let contradictions resolve themselves. They treated hesitation not as weakness, but as evidence of care. Lena testified in late autumn. By then, the leaves had begun to turn, though she barely noticed. The world outside the process had continued, but her attention had narrowed to dates, documents, and the peculiar exhaustion that comes from being both witness and participant. The courtroom was smaller than she'd expected, less imposing, less cinematic. Fluorescent lights instead of shadow and drama. Wood paneling scuffed from decades of use. The air stale with recycled breath and quiet tension. She sat in a side room beforehand, hands folded in her lap, breathing steadily. She hadn't slept well the night before. Sleep came in fragments now, interrupted by dreams that didn't replay events so much as replay sensations. The moment she realized something was wrong, the sound of his voice changing, the sudden awareness of how narrow her world had become without her noticing. But she wasn't shaking. I sat in the back row when they called her name. I watched my daughter walk to the stand with her shoulders straight and her gaze forward. She wore a simple jacket, nothing performative. No armor, no symbolism. Just herself as she was now. She did not look at Aaron. Not once. She spoke clearly. Not emotionally. Not defensively. She described how he entered her life not as a savior, not as a predator, but as a presence that seemed helpful, affirming, attentive. She explained how his interest felt like respect, how his questions felt like care. She spoke about the way he listened not just to what she said, but to how she said it, how he echoed her concerns back to her in slightly altered language, how he framed her ambition as something admirable but fragile, something that needed protection, how slowly, almost imperceptibly, her independence was reframed as something that needed support. When the prosecutor asked her why she hadn't questioned him sooner, the room went still. Not dramatically, practically. The question had weight. Everyone knew it. It was the question survivors always faced, the one that carried implication no matter how gently it was asked. She paused, not because she didn't know the answer, but because the truth required accuracy. "Because he never asked me to trust him all at once," she said finally. "He asked in small pieces, and by the time I realized what I'd given up, I thought it was my fault." The sentence didn't echo. It settled. 5 other women testified, some older than Lena, some younger, some with careers that mirrored hers, others in entirely different fields, different industries, different geographies, different outcomes. But the emotional architecture was identical. Each described a moment when something felt wrong, and a longer stretch when they convinced themselves they were overreacting. Aaron sat through it all without expression. He did not avert his gaze. He did not react. He looked bored, as if this were a delay, an inconvenience, not a reckoning. That, more than anything, sealed the outcome. Sentencing came in early winter. The courtroom felt colder then, though the temperature hadn't changed. People wore heavier coats. Breath lingered faintly in the air near the doors. 16 years in federal prison. The number sounded abstract when it was spoken, a span of time that defied immediate comprehension. Restitution orders tied to every verified victim. Asset seizures. Permanent injunctions. His real name read aloud: Aaron Pike, stripped of polish, stripped of invention, recorded in a public record where it would stay. Lena didn't cry when the verdict was read. She exhaled, just once, deeply, as if she'd been holding her breath for months without realizing it. Her business took longer to recover. Justice did not repair balance sheets. There were audits, reviews, temporary freezes that felt anything but temporary when payroll loomed and vendors needed reassurance. Painful conversations with partners who had trusted her judgment and now wanted certainty she could not responsibly offer. She didn't hide. She didn't deflect. She addressed every concern directly, invited scrutiny, sat through meetings that felt less like negotiations and more like interrogations. She answered questions without embellishment, without minimizing the damage, without trying to recast herself as either hero or victim. Some clients left, quietly, politely, without accusation. Others stayed. A few new ones arrived not because the situation impressed them, but because her response did. They saw transparency without collapse, accountability without self-flagellation, leadership that did not pretend the damage hadn't happened, but also did not allow it to become the entire story. Within a year, the firm expanded again. Not quickly, not recklessly, slowly, intentionally, stronger for the delay. She instituted safeguards not as reactions, but as philosophy, independent reviews, clear separation between personal and professional relationships, oversight structures that did not rely on trust alone, not walls, boundaries. We changed too. We began having dinner every Sunday. No agendas, no lectures, no postmortems unless she brought them up. Sometimes we talked about work, sometimes about nothing at all. Sometimes we sat in companionable silence, the kind that does not require explanation, the kind that signals presence rather than performance. One night, months later, she looked at me across the table and said, "I finally understand what you meant when you said belief without accountability is dangerous." I nodded. "And I understand," she added, "that love shouldn't require silence." That was the reckoning, not the sentence, not the restitution, not even the recovery. But the clarity that came after control was removed when truth no longer had to compete with charm, when trust no longer had to justify itself, and when survival no longer masqueraded as success. Exactly 1 year after the night that nearly destroyed everything, Lena held another gathering. This time it wasn't a launch. It was a recognition ceremony. Her firm had been named one of the fastest growing strategic agencies in the region. Same investors, many of the same clients, even a few of the same faces who had stood frozen in that gallery 12 months earlier, watching her life fracture in public. The venue was different, a restored office building she'd purchased and renovated herself. She kept the exposed brick, kept the open floor plan. She even kept the bench near the entrance. I arrived early again, out of habit more than nerves this time. She found me sitting there, watching her team prepare. "You like this spot?" she said, smiling. "It reminds me of the worst night that led to better days," I replied. She sat beside me, leaning her head lightly against my shoulder, the way she had when she was small and afraid of thunderstorms. "Me too," she said. Later that evening, she took the stage. She thanked her staff, her investors, her clients. Then she paused and looked directly at me. "I also need to thank my father," she said. "A year ago, he saved my business, probably my life. He did it by asking hard questions and refusing to be quiet when it would have been easier." The room applauded. I didn't stand. I didn't need to. Afterward, she handed me an envelope. Inside was a new authorization card for the company accounts. My name listed again, secondary, protective, not controlling. "I trust you," she said. "And if I ever start ignoring my instincts again, I promise I'll listen." Some nights, I still think about Aaron, whatever name he's using in his head now. He wrote letters from prison for a while, claimed he loved her, claimed he'd been misunderstood. She burned them without reading past the first line. Some people never stop trying to control the story. But Lena did. She learned that trust must be earned continuously. That love welcomes scrutiny. That real support doesn't rush you, isolate you, or demand silence. I learned something too, that being a good father doesn't always mean being liked. Sometimes it means being steady when your child pushes you away. Sometimes it means letting yourself be misunderstood to protect someone you love. The man who tried to erase me failed. He didn't take my daughter. He didn't take her business. He didn't take our relationship. And in the end, that mattered more than winning.